Hi, this is Evelyn Lopez. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911.com podcast for the week of March 18, 2019. We are recording at the recycling-friendly New Yard recording studio in Tacoma, Washington. Did you know that March 18th is Global Recycling Day? Well, it is, and that's a big deal to our Earth911.com team. This year, the theme is Recycling into the Future. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So, I think we're all remote today. I am sitting in my spare room at home in Tacoma because I had a little dog makeup disaster this morning that kept me from getting over to Moonyard.
Wait a minute, you put makeup on your dog?
I do not, but the dog wishes to put makeup on herself. So she's chewed. And unfortunately, I had a couple of these lipsticks that are probably not good dog food. But, we'll see how it goes. I did have them. I don't have them anymore. And she's looking very pleased with herself. So there you go. So that's my life in Tacoma. Mitch Ratcliffe, our Earth911 publisher. Where are you from today, Mitch?
Oh, calling from my home office, almost as usual these days.
Okay. And we've got our Earth911 writers, Sarah Lozanova and Trey Granger. Sarah, where are you today?
Hi, Evelyn. I am in beautiful Mid-Coast, Maine.
Okay. Is it still snowy there, or are you seeing signs of spring?
I think signs of spring would be optimistic, but we still have quite a bit of snow on the ground. Less of ice.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, gosh. And Trey, where are you today?
I am in sunny Arizona, Phoenix area, where it hit 90 degrees last week.
Yikes, that sounds so warm. Actually, sounds rather nice. So is this a typical spring or is it sort of unusual weather? Because you had unusual weather the last time we were talking.
We had a very wet February, and it rained the last 2 days. So it's been more extreme weather than we're used to.
Yeah,
you have a nice bloom in the desert, though, from that, I would imagine.
Very true. And we get some snow up in the mountains.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Not bad at all. Well, today, before we start talking about Global Recycling Day, Mitch, I wanted to ask you about a recent interview that's up on the website with the Sustana Group. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, we talked to the Sustana Group, which is a paper making and paper fiber recycling company. You might know their paper division. It's called Roland with 2 L's. And they've been doing paper recycling for about 30 years and have, I think, taken a real step forward in terms of providing a complete accounting of their life cycle, the supply chain insights that you want to understand as a consumer before you accept that something's truly recycled and green. And also in terms of just annual disclosure of their progress and their failures. They're helping a lot of people learn. And the company's been doing interesting experiments. Like last year, they collaborated with Starbucks to separate the paper pulp from the plastic liner in coffee cups. And so we're able to recapture and provide to Starbucks 10 million cups that were made with recycled materials. So their goal is to pull the food packaging industry and regular paper industry to 100% recycled materials as soon as possible. And they're making excellent progress towards that. So we talked with Michelle Bartolini, who is the vice president of marketing there, about how consumers have the power to shape these industries to become sustainable by spending money to support companies that do the right thing. And that transparency we're talking about is an excellent way for other companies to learn to do this. So we're hoping people will pay attention to that.
Oh, that sounds like a really good interview. I'll have to give that a listen. So that's up on the website now if people are so inclined. So we thought we'd talk today about Global Recycling Day. And I didn't actually know that this was a thing until Trey brought it to our attention. But there is a website. If you want to check it out, it's www.globalrecyclingday.com. And in a nutshell, their message is that as a planet, we need to think again about what we throw away. Not so much seeing it as waste, but seeing it as an opportunity. So this is an entity, organization that is looking at partly at just recycling to be cleaner, but also recycling as recovering valuable materials that can be reused. So we thought we'd talk today about some recycling, and we start with world recycling issues. And I know Trey, you had some interesting thoughts on some sort of world trends in the recycling industry. So tell us a little bit about some of the things that are going on that you've been watching.
Sure. And first off, it's worth noting this is only the second year of Global Recycling Day. So it's not like you've been living under a rock for years and years.
The fact that I've missed it isn't that surprising then, but maybe it's
exactly.
We'll get it on the radar today.
But I think what's really great about this day is we can start to look at what other countries and other areas of the world are doing well when it comes to recycling, and hopefully take some of those practices and implement them on a local level. So I always like to highlight what's happening in Europe, because basically the EU is, as far as I'm concerned, the gold standard when it comes to recycling. They've actually set a target of 55% waste diversion by 2025. The US, last time we saw, was about 34%. And that needle has basically not moved since the early 2000s. We've been between 32 and 35 since the last 20 years. So for them to be, they're already in the high 40s, and depending on the country, I mean, some countries like Germany, they're in like the 60%. So wow. They're almost being brought down by some of the other countries that have less infrastructure in place. But one of the big things that Europe does is what's called extended producer responsibility. Because I think what we don't realize as the US is the amount of money that goes into waste management and recycling in general. Mm-hmm. Because you have collection, you have infrastructure. Yes, you can sell these materials and make some money, but there is going to be some upfront costs that you have to pay into. So for some cities, they spend 30 or 40% of their budget on waste management, both recycling and yard waste and whatever they're collecting from residents. And so EPR, extended producer responsibility, is a great way to have manufacturers of these products have that financial stake. So they're actually putting money in, and typically what they will do is they'll pass along that fee to consumers. So you'll pay 5 cents more if you buy a bottle or if you buy a plastic bag. And the money that goes to that will end up going to the local government to pay for the disposal.
So based on looking at the progress or really the lack of progress here in the United States for the last 20 years and the ongoing advances that you see in Germany particularly, but throughout Northern Europe, what would you suggest we should put a producer responsibility law on in the United States in order to start or to catalyze the kind of recycling changes that you think we need?
Well, let's talk about what we already have some good laws in place for. Electronics is a really big one. And shout out to Sarah that Maine there's no national EPR laws in the United States. Each state decides their own ones. Right. And Maine is actually the second highest number of EPR laws. They have 7. Last time I checked, with things like electronics and tires, just stuff that consumers have to buy these things. So let's just give them a very basic tax on the forefront that will fund the disposal at the end. I think it's especially important to get the bulky things that are going to cause a lot of damage in landfills, like tires and electronics.
Okay. Well, and there's certainly a lot of evidence that consumers in the United States will pay a modest additional amount to make sure that something is taken and handled responsibly. We've surveyed our readership on that a couple of times, and then there are a lot of Nielsen and national polls that suggest the same thing. But do you think that seeing that 5 cents on the cost of a bottle, does that turn people off, or does that inspire them for better outcomes?
I mean, I used to live in California and I didn't notice it when I would pay that 5 cents per can or per bottle when I bought something, and I wouldn't go and redeem it when I was returning the product for recycling. I think the big challenge you're going to have when you're talking about EPR for packaging, especially in the United States, grocery stores have some of the lowest profit margins of any businesses we find. And so if we're talking about putting 5 cents onto the cost of that product, who is going to to make that up. Like, because the grocery store probably doesn't have the profit margin that they can absorb any sort of loss of profit.
Sure.
Well, Sarah, in Maine, how does this work? Or, do you notice the EPR type fees that are attached to certain things, or is it just sort of something that gets taken in and not really noticed very much?
Yeah, to be honest, until we decided to highlight this topic, I was unaware of them. I think when you buy new tires, I think there's just a fee that's assessed by them. So I think it's kind of like the bottle deposit, unless you're really staring at your receipt. It's not something that's obvious, but then it does have subtle effects. As far as the bottle deposits, though, one thing I just wanted to mention, I think, is the importance of these fees keeping up with the times. And I think the bottle deposits haven't changed, in 20 years. And so a nickel 20 years ago did have more value than it does now. Like now it's so little that I don't know that it really creates such an incentive for people to get their deposits back. Although my 8-year-old son really likes the 5 cents.
Well, it's interesting. The deposits in California have actually spawned a nighttime industry of bottle picking. And so I know about this from San Francisco. You will find particularly older women who pick bottles and then take them across town on the buses in the middle of the night to collect the 30 or 40 or 50 bucks that they've picked up. And it would be great if instead of forcing these folks to do that ride across town with a big bag of bottles, there was some way to collect it from where they did the picking. We would simply, we'd be creating an income for these folks. Not the greatest income, but still helping them achieve it with less difficulty. And that also, we were talking about brands coming into the community earlier. The idea that a brand that sells a whole lot of stuff in a community, like an Amazon, would help the community deal with the recycling, I think, as well as employ people doing that, is really the kind of commitment that American citizens want to see from the companies that are doing business in their towns and cities.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth us calling out some of the great success stories. One of Earth911's partners over the years, Call to Recycle, that's actually an EPR campaign where every rechargeable battery company, manufacturer, got together and funded battery recycling programs that are available across the United States. So it's definitely possible if business is leading the charge.
Yeah, and that said, consumers drive where businesses go, because if they won't buy it, the business can try, but they're going to go bust. So it's important for consumers to recognize that they're partnering with these businesses, that not just that those businesses are the enemy, because we do need to move forward together or there won't be an economy.
Yeah,
it does, to me, intuitively make sense for businesses to really be an active part of the solution, because they're designing these products. So they pick the inputs that go into them. So right now, I feel like too much of the burden of responsibility is falling on local governments.
Yeah.
And even if we don't have a deposit that we pay when we buy something, we are paying taxes. So it still ultimately comes down to consumers footing the bill if their local governments are paying for waste management.
Yeah. I think that there's actually a little bit of a feel-good component to it, too. I hadn't been thinking about this, but when I get my oil changed, there's an additional fee for, the proper disposal of the used oil. When we buy tires, there's a fee for proper disposal of tires when they're done. And I actually am reassured when I see that, because then I think, okay, good. Then I have a sense here that this is a business that's acting responsibly and is disposing of materials that are not easier to dispose of in a good and responsible way. And that actually makes me feel better about the product and about the business.
Absolutely.
So how do we make better choices when we're trying to drive business in this direction? Now, we've got some articles on the site, like one, for instance, 5 ways to get plastic free. And those are interesting suggestions to follow, but are there ways that we could organize consumers to ask for these programs, to demand them? That's the next step, I think, in how we evolve this. And another set of articles that we've got on the site about the sharing economy and the way that people are organizing to reuse locally may be something that could be extended to ask for producer responsibility laws as well.
Yeah. I think that's a good idea. I also think that there's there is social media sensitivity, at least among larger corporations, and that can be sort of a not terribly difficult way for a large number of people to come together and put on some pressure or make a request of a business. As long as you're kind of avoid being the too general, be a good corporate citizen is too general. You really need to focus in on we want you to do X, and then that can be pretty powerful.
I also think that there's a second level of why we should urge them to do that, and that's material security, their ability to treat the materials that they use as nutrients that they recover from the process and then reuse again. That saves money. Businesses that are organized on these principles perform better overall, both in terms of profit and in investor value. They're 10 to 15% higher over the last 20 years. Sustainable companies are. And so there's a two-prong approach to talking to business about this. One is, as a consumer, I just don't want you to sell me stuff that's bad for the planet. The other is, as a consumer and potentially an investor or somebody who might want to partner with a company or work for a company, I want to see you living these values in order for us to do business together, because it is going to be better for you and me. And finding that common ground, where we've tended to think about, who's at fault and who's the enemy in all this discussion. We're going to move forward with an economy. And I don't think anybody agrees that we should move back to the 1870s because too many people just die all the time in those environments. Mm-hmm. How do we become a social partnership that pulls us forward out of this really wasteful approach we have today? And the producer responsibility laws are a great formal way to do that, but the informal engagement of customers and potential employees with companies to say, we want you to be good, and we want you to be the best you can be, and we'll reward you with our continued loyalty is, I think, the other big lever here that we have to figure out how to put to work.
Well, and that sort of brings me, Trey shared an interesting article with us from the Los Angeles Times from 2016 that really profiled the fact that for a significant population of the world, the garbage collection alone is a real challenge. That we're not even getting to the issue of recycling, but just having a regular and reliable and safe way to dispose of your garbage is a huge issue for a lot of places. And to me, that also says, sort of touches on what you were talking about, Mitch. In some ways, recycling, it's a little bit of a first world problem, but it's also a first world opportunity. Mm-hmm. There are revenues to be gained out of the process. There is money to be made. There is opportunity for business, and that's something that you don't get to if your waste is just piled up willy-nilly and there's no effective systems in place for dealing with it.
Well, and as Trey said, 40% of many municipal budgets are just dedicated to waste management. And if you think mm-hmm. about the growing population in Africa and Asia, and those are the areas where you have far lower waste recovery rates, just overall, trash is mm-hmm. not collected. Just as they leapfrogged us in many ways because mm-hmm. they got mobile phones before they had deep wired infrastructures. So behavior in Africa, but also in India and in China, is very different than the behavior we have here because they were never tied to a physical wired communications infrastructure. They've always had handheld devices. So they think mm-hmm. differently about organizing themselves. And some of that we can learn from and pull back here, where we're still trying to wean ourselves off the physical infrastructure that this economy grew up on.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing about it is most of our packaging is designed with the non-developing world in mind, in the sense that we try to develop packaging that's recyclable and has a one-time use. If you go to these other countries where they're still buying the same products that we buy in the United States, they don't have that curbside, even trash collection, let alone recycling. So if they buy a bottle of water and we in the United States would just throw it in the recycling bin, or if we can't have recycling and throw it in the garbage, they're just going to put it on the beach. And I've seen a stat that one of the big issues we've obviously been talking a lot about over the last 3 or 4 years is this garbage island of plastic in the Pacific Ocean. I think people think that it's a problem because we're littering in the United States. The reality is up to 80% of that plastic is coming from nations where there's no waste collection at all. And so what can we do to help those nations do a better job of collecting material to keep it out of the ocean in the first place?
Yeah, the fact that I saw recently that really woke me up to that is that most of that plastic trash comes from 10 rivers, and 8 of those rivers are in Asia.
Yep.
Yeah, it's funny. I had always been making the assumption that it was our rubbish that somehow was making its way to the Pacific.
Well, there's 7 gyres too.
Okay. So there's more than one gigantic
islands. Not just.
By no means are we innocent in this process, but we definitely aren't the largest contributor.
Yeah.
So
I want to spotlight. There's actually an organization called the World Bank, and they've given about $5 billion since 2000 to fund waste management programs in developing nations. So if people are looking for a nonprofit to support, check out the World Bank, because they're actually doing this. They're putting these grants in motion to try to get these waste management programs in other countries.
Yeah, they're also working on the provenance of things so that you will be able to look at that plastic bottle and understand where it came from. But, like we were talking about the San Francisco late night picking problem, that's also what we could do in these other countries is facilitate a extended producer responsibility fee that would pay people to create their own jobs by picking everything up.
Another issue that I've seen from spending quite a bit of time in Bulgaria is trash being improperly burned, basically. Like there's dumpsters in this village that I spent quite a bit of time in, and people would just carry their trash to the dumpsters. But if they weren't emptied out, people would basically set fire to the things in the dumpster. But it would be plastics and all kinds of things that aren't meant to be burned in an uncontrolled fashion. So there would just be these plumes of smoke, which had to have been creating air quality issues in the village that would just...
Yeah, well, if you're burning something like, it has mercury in it, you're aerosolizing the mercury, and that's terrible for the people standing around that dumpster. Yeah,
absolutely.
But again, you're talking about people are self-organizing their collection. How do we create an incentive to treat that collection as a materials recovery process rather than just disposal? And the whole idea that waste is not waste unless you waste it is the problem we're trying to figure out in this country. I mean, the collapse of recycling on many levels after the China ban is simply the result of our having been too lazy to have actually built a robust recycling system here.
That's true. Yeah.
Or I should say a processing system here. And because we do a good job of picking it up and even separating it in many cases. But now we don't have somewhere we can dump it anymore. And it's been interesting having gotten involved with Earth911 just as this was starting. Some of my friends have said, well, that must be really bad for you that, recycling is on the decline, although the number of searches for recycling on the site is rising. So I think it's a great time for the recycling industry to reinvent itself. And in fact, one of the things we're doing, we're co-sponsoring the Civic Waste conference series at the upcoming Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries conference in LA. So on April 7th and 8th, we'll be participating in discussions about how communities can start to do better jobs with glass and plastic recycling. I'll be actually moderating the plastic session. So we're hoping to get that conversation going with the recyclers. I think it's a great time for a disruptive company to come along and make a big difference.
I think you're right. Recently I do a Tacoma podcast called Crossing Division, and we are going through recycling changes in Tacoma. And so I had a chance to sit down with a couple of people, one of whom was the manager in charge of our waste division in environmental services. And a couple of things he said really struck me. One was on the West Coast, we really don't have a very developed, robust plastics recycling industry because it was always so much cheaper to pop everything into an empty container. A container would come over from China, it's empty, we put all the plastics in it, send it back, and that was just the most cost-effective way of dealing with our plastics recycling. So any sort of domestic program was not competitive. But now, with China not taking our plastic waste, there may be an opportunity for some good domestic systems. Now, he said we're actually still sending waste to parts of India and some other places in Asia. But
they're actually stepping up importing in Vietnam and Indonesia, for instance, in response to this. But that's not any better a solution than we had before.
No, it's not. I mean, we really need to have something that is local. And the other piece that he talked to me about that was an eye opener for me was that our methods of collecting the curbside are actually, in my opinion, have contributed to the problems of things not being easily recyclable. So we collect our recyclables in the same sort of trash trucks as you collect garbage in. So it gets all smushed together. And that's why little pieces of plastic, it just doesn't work in our system because they then get mixed in with the paper and that contaminates our paper recycling. So he had some much clearer guidelines for us on, look at the item and what kind of integrity it has to go through the system. And in many ways, that's more important than just whether it's the right number of plastics. And we've done this to ourselves, right? Because we wanted to make it really easy for us to do curbside recycling. And the ease of it is part of the problem that's contributed to some of our bad habits.
Well, we've always been piggybacking on the garbage system rather than on building a dedicated recycling system.
I think the other thing that's important to consider with plastic, because plastic often gets a bum rap when it comes to the environment because of the way it's made and the way it lasts so long when it's not properly disposed of, is the great thing about plastic is it has so many applications when it is recycled. When you recycle a glass bottle or an aluminum can, much of it goes back into packaging. In the case of plastic, it actually isn't fiscally smart to be making new plastic packaging out of recycled content because the cost is going to be greater. But when you talk about other applications like car seats and building materials, the things where the cost is going to be, or they're going to be using so much plastic that the cost per pound is not going to be as much of a hindrance as it would be for a plastic bottle. We really should be trying to figure out as much as we can how to make those products out of recycled content.
It's a really good point. Another thing I was wondering what you guys think about is bioplastics. Like at first, I didn't think they made sense because of the recyclability issue, but putting it in a global context and considering the contamination of the oceans, do you guys think bioplastics make sense?
Sarah, I think you need to explain to me what exactly a bioplastic is. I'm not really familiar with that.
Yeah, it's basically plastics that are made out of, they're not petroleum based so much. It's more like made out of corn and such. So they're compostable. But I think that one of the issues is that I think they need to be composted in an industrial facility where they can reach higher temperatures. Like I know I've had friends try to compost bioplastics in my backyard recycling bin, and a year later you could still see the container there.
Yeah.
In fact, that's one of our Earthling questions is specifically that question of if it's biodegradable versus compostable, does the litter break down? And the problem with the bioplastics is that it is going to have to go into a composting facility where heat is readily available to break it down, where a lot of people still litter, unfortunately, and it's not going to be any better than any other plastic in that situation. Over the long run, it'll break down faster, but it's still plastic.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the bioplastics in the sense that while it does take less resources to make them, if they're going to end up in a landfill, nothing breaks down in a landfill. They've shown studies that a newspaper will take 2,000 years to break down in a landfill because there's no light and there's no oxygen.
Yep.
And if consumers think that it's a PET bottle because it's made the same way as a regular soda bottle and they try to recycle it, they're just creating contamination, and cities spend $1 million plus per year just on contamination in their recycling programs. So I think it's great in theory to use materials that are more renewable to make these products. We need to do a better job of educating people on how to properly dispose of them, because our current methods are not going to be capitalizing on what the benefits of those products are.
So education, does that start with the children? Because I know you've recently participated in a learning judging contest. I'm also doing the same with Israel right now for a school project to explain the recycling process. And in both cases, it's really inspiring to see the kids thinking about this, making videos about it. It will all be natural and internal, normal thinking for them to be critical about what they throw away and what they pick up. But that's a generation from now who have to grow into their maturity. Will that be too late? So how do we get adults thinking?
I think it's great that students and kids in general are becoming more aware of these recycling issues. As Mitch mentioned, I've talked to students, and the level of awareness that they have of what should go and shouldn't go in their recycling bin is outstanding to me.
Yeah.
Because I remember when I was in school, and I would say I'm in my mid-30s. I'm on the cusp of the millennial generation, and I grew up in California, which is one of the most progressive states out there. We didn't have that training in schools about here's what should go in your recycling bin. So I think it's awesome that we're starting to have that education going on a local level. As far as adults, I don't know what you can do, because I think a lot of them view recycling, the message has always been to them a message of guilt, that, hey, do the right thing. And if you're training people based on guilt, you're not going to get an effective strategy of, I'm going to put a lot of care and time into making sure I'm doing it right. I'm just doing it because I don't want someone to get mad at me or to make me feel bad.
Well, and the guilt only makes it sound more like a hassle too, instead of something that we really ought to just be doing.
Right. But what's great is kids are starting to say, hey, I'm doing this because I understand why it's important, not because I feel bad about not doing it.
I think that's a good point. You know, one of the things that I have been thinking about recently is adults who are recyclers, but who may be really sort of aggressive recyclers because they want to recycle everything, and I'm one of them, do more damage than the casual recycler, because we try to put things into recycling that actually doesn't go there. But those types of people, myself included, are wanting to do it right. So they're highly trainable, and I think it's just an information issue. More information on how to recycle, what is recyclable, and why will be very helpful to that community. Other people who don't want to recycle at all, people who throw a dirty diaper into the recycling bin because they don't care or because their garbage is full, in my opinion, they just need to be kept away from recycling. I would not give them a recycling bin, because, if you really don't care, or you really think it's stupid or something like that, then I kind of feel like you need to stay out of the game instead of, contaminating it.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway that I got out of the government shutdown in January is seeing these national parks just get trashed and graffiti. And it's like, those people are not going to respond to green guilt. The second anything is turned off, they're going to do whatever they want to do. So we need to come up with a strategy to reach those people and show that this is important, and don't do it because you feel like you're going to feel bad if you don't do it. Do it because you understand why it's important. But getting back to the idea of the world recycling, the global recycling market, I actually found in Australia, I was doing research on other countries, and there's a program called Clean Away in Australia that they educate 40,000 students each year on how they can be recycling and recycling better. And so I would love it if we had in America something like that, where we had a national program where people were educating students on the importance of recycling.
Well, Sarah, you've talked a couple of times, or we've talked certainly offline, about programs that your kids have been sort of exposed to or participating in schools. What's your take on sort of how kids are being reached with recycling messages?
I get flyers sent home, and it seems like there are some really good messages going on. Like, I was actually quite impressed when I went to an event at my daughter's school recently, and they had paper plates, but there were metal eating utensils. Nothing was styrofoam, nothing was plastic. And my daughter said that they have reusable trays, reusable plates. So it seems like the cafeteria has done quite a bit to implement zero waste initiatives. We also get handouts about zero waste lunches, which, to be honest, I feel like we pretty much do every day. So to me, it's not new, but I think it's great that they're getting this information out there to parents, where they ask that the parents that pack lunches for their kids, that they use reusable containers and not just contain disposable packaging. So I think that's great that the school is sending out these messages. There's also a food corps program where where kids can opt into gardening during lunchtime. And they've had events where they kind of showcase local foods and things like that. And that indirectly, I think, is a waste reduction initiative as well. So I've actually been quite impressed by the local public school in that regards.
Well, and thinking locally is really the key to the kind of efficiency that we're talking about. Shipping recycled materials halfway across the country to be refined, it makes them untenable as a carbon neutral investment. So thinking more about, like we were talking about, the West Coast needs its own plastic recycling system, not one that dumps plastic overseas. So it all comes back to local. And how do we organize from the grassroots up to start to solve these problems in our communities and then extend those solutions to other communities? And that's really where we are right now with the entire recycling infrastructure in the United States. It's time for a change, and we have to make the turn.
So that sounds like we were talking a little bit before we went on the air about the fact that America doesn't have a recycling mascot or a recycling superhero.
Yeah, although we do, there is Gridiron Green, who is the first, the second sustainability superhero. The first sustainability superhero in the United States was Captain Planet, which was a Ted Turner show back in the 80s. And then we had Woodsy the Owl, and who told us to give a hoot and not pollute. But right. Today, Gridiron Green is a sustainability superhero. He uses STEM skills, and so knowledge of science, technology, engineering, and math, to solve sustainability problems with his team of sidekicks. And Ovi Migueli, who is a former Atlanta Falcons running back, is driving this initiative to get people to be aware in the schools, particularly, of the need for sustainable thinking. So that's encouraging to see. But we do need to set up a standard, one that is not about guilt, but about aspiration to being better. And that is what a superhero or a major mascot can do.
Yeah. Seems like if you could turn the trash into something that's like treasure, that would be a good thing.
I seem to remember something about the Middle Ages and alchemy trying to turn base metals into gold.
Something like that. That would do it. All right. Well,
and it is worth noting that in California, there's a mascot called Recycle Rex. He is a dinosaur that be great if we adopted it nationwide, but Recycle Rex is for California students.
But that's so an extinct character doesn't strike me as the inspiration I want. Is Recycle Rex saying recycle or end up like me?
I don't know what his message is per se. I know he exists.
Well, kids love dinosaurs, though, so maybe that's part of it. But you're right. Saying don't be like me, maybe isn't the best message.
I don't know. That one confuses me. I got to
save me. Yeah.
Hey, producer Doug here. I just wanted to mention also that it's just been announced that James Bond will be driving a no-emissions Aston Martin in his next film.
Oh.
That's exciting.
And that kind of stuff actually makes a difference because people see him being cool in that car. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes acceptable to drive an EV. This kind of stuff is great. Unfortunately, it's just small incremental little steps, and individually, each one of them is merely a novelty.
For now, maybe it'll get better, step by step.
Well, we're growing up.
Well,
we're a kind of slow group of monkeys, but we get there.
We'll get there.
Let's go to Earthling now. There's several of these questions are very aligned with what we've been talking about.
They really do. So our first one comes from Luciano on Facebook, and this is a very sad question and one I have strong opinions on. He says, "Hello, I am desperately trying to find a place locally where I can recycle Kcups. I cannot find any info on the Earth911 website. I am in Boulder County in Colorado. Help me, Earth911. You are my only hope." What do we have to say to Luciano?
I am your father, Luciano.
And we know how well that worked out. Yeah. I would say, Luciano, those Kcups, they're bad news. You got to get some better way of making your daily coffee because they're just not recyclable.
Well, they are recyclable, but they're a pain because the lid needs to be separated from the cup. And the lid can be made of paper, wet paper, aluminum, plastic.
Yeah, usually has some foil in it too.
Right. And so all of that composite lid needs to be separated. And then you still only have the cup, which needs to be rinsed out. So it's an inefficient thing, but it isn't unrecyclable. The question is, how do we get it at volume? So we do have an article about this. You can see what to do with single brew coffee cups, but the answer is basically you have to cut the lid off. And
I would add you may have to take it. You may have to take it somewhere too, because this is my new. I am now totally about this. Not putting things into my recycling for curbside that's going to get squished up and contaminate the papers. And I think that those little Kcups probably should not go into my curbside recycling.
Well, this is where, we talked about the loop introduction a few weeks ago and the idea of a reverse logistics network that's tied to branded products. So now we're back to extended producer responsibility as well. If there was a Keurig program for collecting those cups, that would make me more inclined to use Keurig than another coffee. Oh,
absolutely.
I think what's truly unfortunate, though, in this situation is you just mentioned Keurig, who designs the Kcups. Keurig actually created a new product called Vue, V-U-E, which was designed as a recyclable version of the single-use coffee. And they had to discontinue it in 2014 because people weren't buying it. So it's a situation where we as consumers need to identify the problem, seek alternatives, and when those alternatives are there, start buying them so companies can say, yes, we are going to provide that solution to be more green as companies.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important that Earth911 provide introductions to that kind of information, because people simply don't have a systematic way of thinking about that right now. But you're absolutely right, Trey. If we identify these things even before they've come out and start asking for them, people will deliver them if they know they can sell them. And it's incredible that now I don't know whether the Vue had other design issues that people didn't like, or whether it was simply the fact that they didn't care about the sustainability or the pricing was too high. There's a lot of variables that might change that make that a success today that it wasn't in 2014.
Well, and I guess maybe to try to be a little more helpful to Luciano, I would also add this, contact your local, Boulder area environmental services people and ask them. There may be some place where you can do a drop-off, save up your Keurig cups for a month and then take them into the recycling center. I mean, that is an option for me locally. If there's something that doesn't work in curbside, that doesn't mean I can't recycle it. Yeah. It just means I may have to take it to the recycling center.
But it'd be nice to see a Keurig program that was at the recycling center.
That's wonderful.
That they were really handling this particular material the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a little bit what we were talking about with Sarah about biodegradable versus compostable. So Jeff from Los Angeles says, "Hey, I just saw your video about biodegradable versus compostable. My question is, I'd like to know which is better. for trash found on the ground, i.e., I want to know if a product does get littered, which one will leave zero waste? Is it the biodegradable or the compostable? I'd just like to know what is best for the environment under those circumstances. So this is the interesting thing I was thinking of when you were talking about the plastics versus compostable versus regular plastics that are recyclable. It's like we have this sort of world of disposal, and we have people who are going to make a real effort to recycle, and for them, the regular plastics may be the best option. We have people who don't have the type of trash pickup that we have in this country, and for them, maybe something that sits out in the sunshine and breaks down would be better. And then we have also the possibility of a really robust commercial composting facility. And in that case, the compostable would get, broken down the most quickly. So what do you think? What's best for the environment? Is there a best?
I think the problem we have here is in a vacuum, we could probably make this decision, but the problem is nothing will no trash will stay on the ground, especially if we're talking about a bag or a bottle. When wind starts blowing, it's going to go somewhere else, and it will probably either end up in a landfill or in the ocean. And in either of those cases, there won't be enough sunlight or oxygen for anything to happen to that product. It's just going to stay around forever. So we should worry less about what happens to litter and more about how do we make sure litter is going in the right place.
One thing that I consider kind of concerning about all of these is that the inputs aren't particularly sustainable either. Like corn is not a very sustainable agricultural crop, but petroleum products aren't very green either, obviously. So I think it would be great to develop containers that are just made out of more sustainable inputs. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like we're asked to choose between two pretty undesirable things.
And yet they're both presented as desirable alternatives to traditional materials. And of course, the irony here is he's asking which one is the least harmful litter. And what we need to do is get past the idea that there is litter, that it is all the raw materials of our economy. And if it's stuck in the form of litter or stuck in a landfill or stuck in somebody's backyard, not composting, that's a bad thing. That's actually inefficiency, and we need to take it out of the system.
Okay. So I think we have said we don't have a very clear answer. It really depends on the circumstances, and what we need to do is focus our energies on things that maybe are more sustainable to create and more easy to get rid of later.
Yeah, certainly. Although the straight answer for Jeff's question is the compostable materials definitely need heat, whereas the biodegradable materials ostensibly will break down without that heat.
Yeah, that
doesn't make either of them better litter.
Gotcha.
So if Jeb lives in Phoenix, but he's in LA. If he was in Phoenix, he might have that heat, but in LA, he probably doesn't have the heat.
Yeah. I can remember a little while ago, which means probably 10 years ago, they were coming out with plastic bags at the grocery stores, I think down in California, that were green plastic bags, and that would, they sort of evaporate, or they break down very rapidly in direct sunshine.
They were corn-based.
Yeah, and it didn't work. Ironically, it didn't work that well because they broke down really well. So they would start to fall apart, while they were still sort of in their use life. And they went away. But that made me think that there are some things that will break down pretty quickly, but I think they may be difficult to make product out of them.
Well, and that's why materials engineering is one of the most important areas of science that we're investigating now as a species. So things can be engineered to break down at the right time. In that case, they were going for incredibly fast, and the use case didn't match the need or the material. Yeah. This is my daytime engineering thinking working.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So our third question is kind of related and interesting. I haven't heard this tweak before. It says, "Hi, my local transfer recycling station only accepts glass that contained food or drink. Do you have any suggestions how to recycle clean jars that contained a candle? seems such a waste to throw it out in the trash. Thank you.
So this is actually a case where we are making products that are more durable and therefore harder to recycle. So I don't think a lot of people realize that the glassware that you drink out of and your Pyrex cookware and stuff, it's actually treated with material. So it's going to be more likely to survive a fall. So if you drop it, it will be more durable and hopefully last you longer. The problem with that, and we may have addressed this on previous podcasts, in order to recycle glass, you have to melt it down in a kiln, and the temperature will be different for treated glass versus container glass. And so a lot of programs will say no treated glass because if it goes in there, it's going to ruin the kiln. It'll make it so that you have half melted glass and if you try to overcook to melt everything, you're going to burn off the actual container glass. So they're very different recycling processes. I'm not aware of anything where you have a solution for recycling treated glass.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this once before when we were talking about Pyrex, and I hadn't realized that, but it makes sense.
Well, but in this case, if you've got something that has wax on it, so you have a wine bottle that you put wax on, or a candle on and wax stripped down on, you can, and I've done this. You can boil those that glass. You have to boil it so that it's upright, and the liquid wax, once it melts, floats up and out. And then you can just let it cool. The wax will harden on top. You break the wax off the top, and then you've got your bottles back to just glass. And there may be a little bit of residue left, but that should clean them up to the point where they could be taken in and dropped off without having a wax contamination problem. But the problem that we're talking about is that you don't really know what kind of glass you've got.
So that's a good recommendation then for people that you're using glass for art or display or candles. Use glass bottles, use wine bottles, use things that you know are recyclable, because as Mitch said, anything that you do to alter that is not going to affect the recycling process. The chemicals that they put into glass will alter the recycling process.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I recently asked,
mason jars are a problem in recycling centers.
Because they're a different kind of glass.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah, I love mason jars.
But the key is they're more durable. They'll last you longer. And that really should be our overarching goal as a society, is to make things that last us longer, to resist disposal in the first place.
Yep.
But we just got to realize when it does break, we don't have an option for disposal.
I recently asked some local glass artists if they could reuse wine bottles, beer bottles, any kind of bottles. And they sort of explained to me that no, even when you're blowing glass, you just, you get it in its most basic form. And there's even different types of glass that you can't mix together. And the glasses that are used for bottles, there's really no way to break them down and reuse them. You can melt them a little bit into different types of glass sculptures, but you can't get them down to the glass sand type structure that you blow glass out of.
Well, so there's our answers. And as usual, they are complex answers because we're living in increasingly complex times.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's it for this episode. We've talked about recycling around the world and some of the challenges of recycling locally. We always appreciate your suggestions, especially if you have ideas for things you'd like us to focus on in future episodes. You can send us email at, send it to Facebook. I'm sorry. Send it to feedback at earth911.com. You can also leave us suggestions on our Facebook page. And stay tuned at iTunes, SoundCloud, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and of course at our earth911.com website. And we'll see you next time.